He was tutored by a philosopher, crowned a king at 20, and master of the known world before he was 30. In just 13 years of conquest, he never lost a single battle. This is the life of Alexander the Great. In the 4th century before Christ, the Greek world was a patchwork of rival city-states, while to the east loomed the Persian Empire, the largest the world had ever known. For a century and a half, Persia had been the great power of the age. All of that was about to change. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedon, a rugged kingdom on the northern edge of Greece. His father was King Philip II, a brilliant general who had forged the Macedonians into the finest army in the world. His mother was Olympias, a fierce and devoted princess from neighboring Epirus. As a boy, Alexander tamed a magnificent black stallion that no one else could ride. He had noticed the horse was simply afraid of its own shadow, and turned it toward the sun. He named the horse Bucephalus, and would ride him into battle for the next 20 years. When Alexander was 13, Philip hired the philosopher Aristotle to be his tutor. For 3 years Aristotle taught him philosophy, science, medicine, and politics. He gave Alexander a lifelong love of Homer's Iliad, and the young prince came to model himself on its hero, Achilles. It was said that Alexander slept with a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, beneath his pillow, beside a dagger. At just 18, Alexander commanded the cavalry on the left wing at the Battle of Kyrenia. His charge helped annihilate the sacred band of Thebes, 300 elite warriors who died fighting where they stood, and shattered the army of Thebes and Athens, making Philip the master of Greece. The boy had become a soldier. Then, in 336 BC, at the wedding of his daughter, King Philip was struck down by an assassin's blade. In an instant, Alexander, just 20 years old, was king of Macedon. Rivals and enemies thought the young king would be easy to overthrow. They were wrong. Alexander moved swiftly to secure his throne, crushed his opponents, and forced the Greek cities to confirm him as their leader, just as they had his father. When the great city of Thebes revolted against him, Alexander made a terrible example of it. He stormed the city and razed it to the ground, sparing only its temples and the house of the poet Pindar. All of Greece took note. No one would defy him again. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of around 40,000 men. Tradition says he hurled a spear into the soil and declared all of Asia a prize won by the spear. On the way, he visited the ruins of Troy and honored the tomb of Achilles. His army was built around a fearsome Macedonian phalanx, bristling with 18-foot pikes called sarissas, and the hard-charging companion cavalry, which Alexander led in person at the decisive moment of every battle. At the Granicus River, Alexander met a Persian army for the first time. Leading the charge himself, he was nearly killed, saved at the last moment by his friend Clitus. The Persians were routed, and one by one the Greek cities of Asia Minor were freed from Persian rule. At Gordium lay an ancient knot, and a prophecy that whoever could untie it would rule all of Asia. Alexander, the story goes, did not waste time picking at it. He simply drew his sword and cut it through. At Issus, Alexander finally faced the Persian king himself, Darius III, and his vast royal army. Though heavily outnumbered, Alexander charged straight at Darius. The great king panicked and fled the field, abandoning his own mother, wife, and children to capture. On that narrow plain between the mountains and the sea, Persia's vast numbers had counted for nothing. What Alexander did next astonished the ancient world. Rather than harm Darius's captured family, he treated them with respect and royal honor. It was a calculated mercy, and it won him a reputation that would open many gates without a fight. Marching south, Alexander came to the island city of Tyre, which refused to surrender. For 7 grueling months he besieged it, building a great causeway out into the sea to reach its walls. When the city finally fell, his vengeance was harsh, thousands of its defenders were killed, and much of the surviving population was sold into slavery. Egypt, long resentful of Persian rule, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. He was crowned pharaoh and embraced as a son of the gods. Here, far from home, he began to see himself as something more than a Macedonian king. Alexander made a dangerous trek across the desert to the remote oracle of Ammonius at Siwa. What the oracle told him, he never fully revealed, but he emerged convinced of his own divine destiny, greeting him, it was said, as the son of a god. On the Egyptian coast, Alexander founded a new city and gave it his name, Alexandria. It would grow into the greatest city of the ancient world, home to a towering lighthouse and the legendary Library of Alexandria, a beacon of learning for centuries. Then came the reckoning. On the plain of Gaugamela, Darius gathered an enormous army for a final stand. Outnumbered perhaps 5 to 1, Alexander drew the Persian line out of position, then drove his cavalry like a spearhead straight through the gap that opened toward Darius himself. Once again the great king fled, and with that single brilliant stroke, the Persian Empire was Alexander's. The mighty city of Babylon threw open its gates, and Susa surrendered its staggering royal treasury. Alexander, once king of a small northern kingdom, now sat upon the throne of the Persian great kings. At Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, Alexander seized the greatest prize of all. But its magnificent palace was burned to the ground, whether as cold revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece long before, or in a drunken night of celebration, historians still debate to this day. One famous tale blames a courtesan named Thais, who urged the drunken king to put the palace to the torch. Alexander pursued the fleeing Darius across the empire. But before he could reach him, Darius was murdered by one of his own commanders, Bessus. Alexander gave the fallen king a royal funeral and hunted down his killer. He was now, beyond question, the king of Asia. To rule his vast new empire, Alexander began to adopt Persian dress and court customs, and took Persians into his army and government. He dreamed of fusing his peoples into one. But his Macedonian veterans were proud and uneasy, and resentment quietly grew. The years of victory had a darker side. Fearing conspiracy, Alexander had his general Philotas executed, and the old commander Parmenion killed. And one terrible night, in a drunken rage, he ran through his loyal friend Clitus, the very man who had saved his life at the Granicus. His grief afterward was said to be uncontrollable. In the wild lands of Central Asia, Alexander faced his hardest fighting yet, a grinding guerrilla war against the rebel Spitamines. It took 3 exhausting years, and the storming of seemingly impregnable mountain fortresses, before the region was finally subdued. When the defenders of one sheer cliff fortress jeered that he would need soldiers with wings, Alexander sent men scaling the rock face by night, and seized it. In Bactria, Alexander married Roxana, the daughter of a local nobleman, said to be the most beautiful woman in Asia. It was a union of love and of politics, a living symbol of the new world he hoped to build, where conqueror and conquered would become one people. Still Alexander pressed on, leading his army over the Hindu Kush mountains and into India, a land at the very edge of the Greek world's knowledge. The king of Taxila welcomed him as an ally, but beyond the next river waited a defiant king named Porus, with a battle line of some 200 war elephants. At the Hydaspes river, in driving monsoon rain, Alexander fought King Porus and his terrifying war elephants. It was the toughest battle of his life, but he won. Impressed by the courage of his defeated foe, Alexander restored Porus to his throne as an ally. It was here that Bucephalus, the warhorse Alexander had ridden since boyhood, finally died. Heartbroken, Alexander founded a city on the riverbank and named it Bucephala, in honor of the companion who had carried him across half the world. Alexander wanted to march on, to the very edge of the world. But at the Hydaspes river, his exhausted soldiers had finally had enough. 8 years from home, they refused to take another step east. For the first time in his life, Alexander was forced to turn back. The journey home was a nightmare. Sailing down the Indus, Alexander leapt almost alone over an enemy wall and took an arrow through the chest. For a time his soldiers believed their king was dead. Then, still recovering, he led part of his army through the scorching Gadrosian desert, where thirst and heat killed thousands more than any enemy ever had. Back in Persia, Alexander pushed his dream of unity further still. At Susa, in a single grand ceremony, he had 90 of his officers marry Persian noblewomen, and took a daughter of Darius as a wife himself. When his Macedonian troops mutinied in protest at Opis, he faced them down, then told his angry veterans that he counted them all as his kinsmen, and reconciled with them in a vast feast of thousands. Then tragedy struck. Hydaspes, Alexander's closest companion since boyhood and his most trusted general, fell ill and died. Alexander's grief was boundless. He mourned for days, refusing food, and at Babylon he planned a funeral pyre of staggering size and cost, ordering that Hydaspes be honored across the empire. Alexander returned to Babylon, already planning new campaigns, perhaps into Arabia and beyond. But in June of 323 BC, after a banquet, he was seized by a raging fever. Within days, the conqueror of the world was dead, just 32 years old. The true cause has been argued over for more than 2,000 years. As he lay dying, his commanders asked to whom he left his empire. Tradition says he answered only, to the strongest. He left behind a pregnant wife and a leaderless empire that stretched across 3 continents, and no one with the power to hold it together. Almost at once, his ambitious generals turned on one another in the long and bloody wars of the Successors. The empire was torn into rival kingdoms. Ptolemy seized Egypt, Seleucus took the vast east, and within a few decades, Alexander's own family had all been murdered. Even his body became a prize. Ptolemy seized the magnificent funeral carriage bearing it and carried it off to Egypt, entombing Alexander in the city that bore his name. And yet the world Alexander made did not die with him. From the Mediterranean to the borders of India, Greek language, art, and ideas mingled with the cultures of the East, beginning what we call the Hellenistic Age. Cities he founded became centers of learning that shaped civilization for centuries. In just 13 years, Alexander had conquered an empire of over 2 million square miles, founded some 20 cities, and never once been defeated in battle. He had set out to rival the heroes of legend, and in doing so, he became one himself. His empire crumbled, but his legend has endured for more than 2,000 years. Alexander the Great, a legend of power. If you enjoyed his story, follow for more of history's greatest leaders.